3 years ago, I lived in a tiny apartment in a rough part of Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is Derek. I was 25 then, working tirelessly at a trading company to support my family back home. The area I lived in was notorious for theft and crime, but it was all I could afford. Despite the dangers, I managed to stay safe, until one unforgettable night. It was a quiet Tuesday, or at least as quiet as Las Vegas gets. The clock struck 2 a.m., and I was lounging on the couch, munching on chips and watching the news. My eyes were heavy, but I wasn't ready to call it a night. Suddenly, I noticed my phone battery was dangerously low. The charger was in my bedroom, and though I felt too lazy to get up, I finally forced myself off the couch. As I walked toward the bedroom, something made me stop mid-step. My feet froze, and my heart skipped a beat. On the wooden floor, just past the kitchen, were dark red stains, small, uneven prints, as if made by a tiny animal. They glistened faintly under the dim light. My mind raced. Was it blood? It couldn't be. I didn't own a pet, and I hadn't heard a single sound all night. The prints started near the window by the front door and formed a trail, leading straight to my bedroom. My pulse quickened. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Could it be an animal? A thief? Something worse? I tiptoed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The silence was deafening. As I approached the bedroom door, I noticed it was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. The faint creak of the hinges sent chills through me. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath hitching. The bloodstains continued across the floor, stopping near the bedroom window. I glanced around the room. Everything seemed untouched. No sign of a break-in, no sign of anything unusual except those eerie prints. I hesitated, but eventually walked over to the window. It was locked. How was that possible? The prints started at the main door's window, led here, and now, nothing. I felt like I was being watched, though no one else was in the room. My chest tightened. Was it just my imagination? I couldn't shake the feeling of something unseen lingering nearby. The rest of the night, I sat on the couch, wide awake, clutching a baseball bat I kept for emergencies. Every creak, every rustle in the building made me jump. I couldn't sleep, not with the thought of what might have happened. Was it an injured thief? Or was it something not of this world? The following week was a nightmare. I kept hearing faint whispers in the apartment at odd hours. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corners of my vision, vanishing when I turned to look. I was terrified, but also curious. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of soft scratching. It was coming from the bedroom. My heart pounded as I grabbed the bat and crept toward the door. When I opened it, the room was empty, but on the window pane were fresh, bloody paw prints, smeared as though something had pressed against the glass. That was the final straw. I moved out within days, unable to bear the oppressive fear that had taken over my life. Even now, I can't explain what happened in that apartment. Was it just an injured animal or a thief? Or was it something darker, something that can't be explained by logic? I'll never know, but I've never stopped wondering. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations that defy explanation, leaving us haunted by questions that may never be answered. Fear, curiosity, and the unknown can push us to our limits. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? A moment that made you question reality? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. My name is Diana Hayes. What I'm about to share is something I wish I could erase from my memory, but no matter how hard I try, it lingers, like a shadow that never fades. It happened last winter, during my first semester living alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. I had moved there to focus on my studies, but little did I know those peaceful nights would turn into something I'd never forget. The first knock came at exactly 12:45 a.m. I remember the time because I'd just looked at my phone after finishing a long scroll through social media. The sound was soft, almost hesitant. A double knock on the front door. For a second, I thought it was my imagination. It couldn't possibly be someone at that hour. I ignored it, telling myself it was probably the wind or some animal brushing past the door. But then it came again. Louder this time, sharp and deliberate. I froze, my fingers gripping my blanket as my pulse raced. My heart told me to stay put, but curiosity pushed me to get up. I tiptoed to the door, each creak of the wooden floorboard beneath my feet making me flinch. Standing a safe distance away, I leaned toward the peephole, squinting as the dim porch light barely illuminated the space outside. No one was there. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm my nerves. "You're overthinking, Diana," I whispered to myself, closing my eyes tightly as if that would erase the fear. I double-checked the lock before retreating to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed for hours, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. The next night, it happened again, this time at 2 a.m. I was wide awake, scrolling through my phone to distract myself from the growing unease that had settled in since the previous night. When the knock came, my body went cold. It wasn't soft anymore. It was aggressive. 3 heavy knocks that echoed through the house. My throat went dry as I stared at the door, paralyzed with fear. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my phone and called my parents, who were staying in a nearby city. My father assured me it was probably nothing, but his words didn't ease my mind. He came over the next morning to check the area but found no footprints, no signs of anyone. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Things escalated when my parents had to leave for a few days for an emergency, leaving me alone in the house. I tried to act brave, but deep down, I was terrified. The first night alone, I barely slept, listening intently for any sound. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, it started on my bedroom window. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. Before I could even move, the knock shifted to the main door, then to the back door. It was like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to know they were there. The final knock came from the floor beneath my bed. I screamed, scrambling to the far corner of the room with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Desperate, I called my neighbors, but no one answered. Tears streamed down my face as I realized I had no choice but to confront this nightmare. Summoning every ounce of courage, I peeked through the curtains of my bedroom window. And that's when I saw him. A tall man, dressed in a long gray coat, standing motionless outside my main gate. Even in the darkness, I could see the red stains on his coat, stains that looked like blood. He wasn't moving, but his presence was suffocating. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The police arrived quickly, searching the area thoroughly, but by the time they came, the man was gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing to prove that he had been there. The next morning, my parents installed CCTV cameras around the house, but even with the cameras, I couldn't shake the fear. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly, and every knock, no matter how innocent, sent chills down my spine. To this day, the memory of that man standing at my gate haunts me. Was he real? Or was it something else entirely? And if he was real, what did he want? Sometimes, the scariest moments in life are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. What would you do if you were in my situation? Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Let's talk about what lessons we can take from these encounters, whether they're rooted in fear or courage. My name is Logan, and even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. I've told this story only once before, but I think it's time I share it again. Maybe someone out there will understand. It all began when my husband, Derek, and I moved to Sparks, Nevada. We were newly married and eager to start our lives in what felt like the perfect home. It was a modern house, built where an old, decrepit one had once stood. The previous house had been torn down just months before we moved in, and the fresh construction still smelled of paint and sawdust. At first, everything was perfect. The house was bright, airy, and filled with potential. We spent our days decorating and planning our future, but looking back, I realized there were signs from the very beginning. Small things I ignored because I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. The first incident happened about 4 months after we moved in. Derek was working a night shift, and I was alone. It was around 1 a.m., and I went down to the basement to grab some boxes. I remember being puzzled because the basement light was already on. I was sure I'd turned it off the last time I was down there. But I shrugged it off. Maybe Derek had forgotten. As I reached for a box on the top shelf, I heard it. A faint rustling sound like someone shifting their weight on creaky floorboards. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was nothing, probably the house settling or a draft. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When Derek got home the next morning, I told him what had happened. He laughed it off, saying I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I wanted to believe him, so I tried to forget about it. But then things started happening more frequently. One night, Derek and I were watching TV in the living room when the overhead light flickered and went out. At first, we thought it was a power issue, but the other lights in the house were fine. Derek replaced the bulb, but the flickering happened again the next night, and the night after that. Then there were the noises. Late at night, we'd hear faint footsteps coming from the basement. Sometimes it sounded like someone was pacing back and forth. Derek insisted it was just the house settling, but I wasn't so sure. One morning I woke up to find the kitchen window smeared with what looked like streaks of blood. My stomach turned as I stared at the red marks, which seemed to trail downward as if something had been dragged across the glass. Derek came in and saw me frozen in place. He tried to convince me it was just a bird, injured and crashing into the window. But the streaks were too deliberate, too unnatural. Still, Derek refused to acknowledge that something was wrong. "It's just a new house, Logan," he said. "You're letting your nerves get to you." But I wasn't imagining things. One night, while Derek was out, I decided to stay up and read. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously walked toward the noise. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. My pulse quickened as I rounded the corner and pointed the flashlight toward the window. For a moment I thought I saw a shadow, a tall, thin figure standing just outside the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. I locked every door and window that night, my heart racing with fear. The final straw came a week later. Derek and I had just gotten home from a late dinner, and as we walked into the house, we were hit with an overpowering smell. It was like rotting meat, thick and suffocating. We searched the house, thinking maybe an animal had died in the walls, but we couldn't find anything. The smell lingered for hours before finally dissipating. That night, I had the most vivid nightmare I've ever experienced. I dreamt I was in the basement, surrounded by darkness. I could hear whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to echo all around me. When I turned to run, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. When I told Derek about the dream, he finally admitted that he'd been experiencing strange things too. He said he'd felt someone watching him when he was home alone and had heard whispers late at night, but he'd brushed it off, thinking it was just his imagination. We decided to do some research on the property, and what we found still haunts me to this day. The house that had stood there before ours had been torn down because of structural instability, but the real story was far darker. Years ago, the old house had belonged to a man named Harold Greaves. He was a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors. When he died, authorities discovered a hidden room in the basement. Inside were dozens of personal items, locks of hair, photographs, and even children's toys. The most chilling discovery was a shallow grave beneath the floorboards. The remains of at least 2 people were found, but their identities were never determined. The house was demolished, and our new home was built directly on top of it. After learning this, Derek and I couldn't stay another night. We packed our bags and left, leaving behind most of our belongings. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. It's been years since we left that house, but I still have nightmares. Sometimes I hear whispers in the dark or feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I don't know if it's just my imagination or if something followed us when we left. If you ever feel like something is wrong, trust your instincts. Don't wait as long as we did. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Do you believe some places hold on to the past in ways we can't understand? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. I still don't understand what happened during those terrifying hours. This story has stayed buried in my mind, haunting me every time I think about it. My name is Zane. It happened 2 years ago when I was living with my parents and younger brother in a small village in Elko City, Nevada. We were renting a modest apartment because it was all we could afford at the time. The apartment itself was okay, but there was one problem that overshadowed everything. The landlord. He was a tall, wiry man in his late 50s with an unsettling air about him. He had a way of appearing out of nowhere, his presence cold and heavy, like a shadow that loomed over us. Sometimes he would stop by for trivial reasons, pretending to check on things, but it was clear he wanted control over our lives. He was unpredictable. Some days he'd show up with a forced smile, trying to seem friendly. Other times he'd argue with my parents over small matters, rent payments, maintenance, even where we parked our car. My parents hated his behavior, but felt trapped. We didn't have the money to move, and for the most part, we managed to avoid him. Until that day. It was a Saturday afternoon and my parents had taken my little brother Liam out for some shopping. I stayed behind to work on my college assignment and play games in my room. The house was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds outside. Around 3 p.m., our dog, Shadow, started barking. At first I ignored it, thinking he'd spotted a squirrel or a stray cat. But then his barking grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't his usual bark. It was a deep, guttural growl, the kind that made your skin crawl. Curious, I walked to my bedroom window and peeked outside. That's when I saw him. The landlord was pacing back and forth in our front yard, dressed entirely in black. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his coat, and his head was tilted downward, but his eyes, those cold, dark eyes, were fixed on our house. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there for a moment frozen as Shadow continued to bark wildly. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the landlord looked up. Our eyes met, and he smiled. A slow, twisted smile that didn't reach his eyes. I quickly stepped away from the window, my pulse racing. I grabbed my phone and debated calling my parents, but I didn't want to panic them. Instead, I walked to the front door and made sure it was locked. "Mr. Harris?" I called out through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "My parents aren't home. Can you come back later?" There was a long pause. Then his voice came, muffled but clear. "I just wanted to drop something off for you, Zane. Some toys for your brother. Open the door, won't you?" Toys? My brother was 8, but Mr. Harris had never shown any interest in him before. Something about his tone made my stomach churn. "No, thank you," I replied, louder this time. "You can leave them outside. My parents will get them later." For a moment there was silence. Then his voice shifted, deceptively kind, almost playful. "Come on, Zane. I'm just being nice. Don't you trust me?" The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. When I didn't respond, his tone changed again. This time, it was laced with anger. "You think you can ignore me? You think you're better than me?" I grabbed the wooden bat my dad kept behind the front door and stepped back into the living room. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I heard him pacing outside, muttering to himself. Every now and then, Shadow would bark, his growls echoing through the house. I stayed quiet, gripping the bat tightly, and waited. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the muttering stopped. I peeked through the curtains and saw him walking away, his figure disappearing down the street. I let out a shaky breath and sank onto the couch, my body trembling from the adrenaline. When my parents returned, I told them everything. My dad's face turned red with anger and my mom looked pale. They promised to confront the landlord the next day, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We all knew we had to leave. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. That night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on glass. My first thought was the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I got out of bed and grabbed the bat, my hands shaking. As I crept through the dark hallway, shadows started growling from the living room. The tapping grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the back door. I approached the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen was dark, and the only light came from the moon, shining through the window. I reached for the curtain covering the glass panel of the door and hesitated. What if he was standing there? I took a deep breath and pulled the curtain aside. There was no one there. But then I noticed something on the glass. Handprints, smudged and uneven, as if someone had pressed their palms against the door and dragged them downward. My stomach twisted and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the bat. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, my dad called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. Mr. Harris denied everything, claiming he hadn't been near our house. Without evidence, the police couldn't take action. We moved out the following week. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Was Mr. Harris just a creepy landlord? Or was there something darker behind his actions? Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of tapping on glass and it all comes rushing back. Have you ever had a strange encounter with someone you couldn't quite understand? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. It was a warm summer afternoon when I, Lucas, and my 4 closest friends decided to head to the park. We lived in a quiet little neighborhood in Fernley, Nevada, and it was our usual spot to escape the monotony of our everyday lives. The park was about 30 minutes away from our house, a place where we could be free, play games, and forget about everything for a while. That day felt just like any other. We were laughing, enjoying each other's company, and looking forward to the adventures we always created. But there was one thing I didn't expect that would forever change the way I saw the world. As we walked into the park, we noticed a man standing by the swings. At first, he didn't seem out of place, just a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a jacket and jeans, surrounded by a few kids. He was acting in a way that caught our attention, though. His exaggerated hand gestures, his forced smile, and his way of speaking to the children felt strange. It wasn't just the way he spoke, it was the way the kids responded. They laughed and followed his every move, almost like they were hypnotized. One of my friends, Cameron, was always the curious one, the kind who never backed away from anything. He was fascinated by this man, even more than the rest of us. The man's smile seemed too wide, too fake, and something about his eyes felt off. Cameron stood there for a moment, watching him closely. Then, without warning, Cameron walked up to the man. We watched in silence as they exchanged words, their conversation muffled by the wind. I could see Cameron nodding, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. We thought it was just harmless conversation, so we continued walking around, not thinking much of it. But as we started gathering our things to leave, I glanced back and saw something that froze me in place. Cameron was still standing with the man, his posture odd, rigid, and unnatural. There was a strange look in his eyes. They were no longer the vibrant blue I knew so well, but now they looked yellowish, dull, and lifeless. My heart skipped a beat. "Cameron," I shouted. He didn't respond at first, but then, slowly, he turned. His face was pale, his lips dry, and his body trembled as though he were cold. His legs wobbled, and he struggled to stay upright. I rushed to him, my friends close behind. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I asked, shaking his arm. He could barely speak. I don't feel right," Cameron muttered, his voice weak. He looked like he was about to collapse. His eyes rolled to the back of his head, and his body went limp. We caught him just in time before he hit the ground. Panic hit us like a freight train. "What happened to him?" one of my friends asked, voice shaking. "I don't know, but we need to get help," I replied, my heart racing. I could feel my hands trembling as I tried to lift Cameron, but he was too heavy. His body seemed to have no strength left in it. The sun seemed to disappear behind a thick cloud, and the air turned cold. It wasn't just the temperature that was chilling, though. It was the feeling that something was wrong, something that we couldn't explain. We called for help immediately. The ambulance came, but Cameron's condition worsened as they tried to revive him. His breathing was shallow, his pulse erratic. We all stood there, helpless and terrified, as the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him. But it felt like time was running out. It felt like whatever was happening to Cameron wasn't just an illness. It was something much darker. After what felt like an eternity, Cameron's parents arrived, along with the rescue team. They took him away, and I watched as the ambulance drove off. But even as the sound of the sirens faded into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to the air. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't figure out what it was. That night we sat in my house, not knowing what to think. Cameron was in the hospital, and we still had no idea what had caused his sudden collapse. The doctors said they couldn't find any clear reason for his condition. No fever, no illness, just his body shutting down. But then, something struck me. I remembered the man in the park. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that he had something to do with what happened to Cameron. His strange behavior, the way he looked at us. It felt like he was watching us for a reason I couldn't understand. What if he had done something to Cameron? What if he had made him sick on purpose? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had to investigate. We returned to the park, hoping to find some clue, some trace of what had happened. But when we got there, everything was different. The park was empty. The swing swayed gently in the breeze, and the trees rustled as the wind passed through them. There was no sign of the man, no children, just the silence that hung heavy in the air. We walked through the park, trying to make sense of what had happened. As we approached the swings where the man had been standing, I noticed something strange. The ground around the swing set was disturbed, as if someone had been digging, but there was no hole. It was as if something had been dragged through the dirt, leaving a faint trail behind. I felt a chill run down my spine. "This isn't right," I whispered. One of my friends, Ethan, suggested we go talk to the police. We needed to find out more about the man, and if there were any reports of strange behavior in the area. But when we arrived at the station, we were told that they had no information on the man. The description we gave them didn't match any known suspects. I couldn't understand it. How could someone vanish so quickly, especially after what had happened? It didn't make sense. Days passed and Cameron's condition improved, but he couldn't remember what had happened in the park. He didn't even recall meeting the man. The doctors couldn't explain it either, and the whole situation felt like a dark fog that we couldn't escape. It wasn't until a week later, when Cameron's parents received an anonymous tip, that things started to make sense. The tip led them to a nearby abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found something horrifying. There were pictures of kids, all from the park, all with the same man. The photos were old, faded, and the man's face was distorted in every shot, like something was trying to hide behind his eyes. But the most chilling discovery came when they found a small notebook hidden in the attic. It was filled with strange writings and drawings. Some of the pages were torn, but the ones that remained clearly described a ritual to manipulate people, to make them do things against their will. And at the center of it all was the man, the one who had approached Cameron. When we heard about this, we were terrified. Had this man been trying to brainwash us? Had he already begun the process with Cameron? We never saw him again, but the feeling of unease remained. I could never forget the look in Cameron's eyes as he stood by the swings, his body trembling. I couldn't forget the way the air had turned cold, as though something was watching us, something waiting for the right moment. And now, years later, every time I go to the park, I still feel it. The sense of dread, the fear that something is lurking just beyond what we can see. It's not something I can explain, but it's something I know deep in my bones. That man, he's still out there. I'm sure of it. Have you ever had an experience where you felt like you were being watched or manipulated by someone? How did you deal with it? Share your thoughts in the comments.